Think about this. Moses, he's an ideal person to be placed in this position. Why is that? Because he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. He would have been steeped in all sorts of ancient wisdom as he was being raised as a young prince in the land of Egypt.
Hello and welcome to Sacred Book, a respectful, long conversation about the New Testament and the Tanakh from a Christian perspective who happens to be
Steve, me.
And an atheistic perspective who happens to be Mark, myself. There are no shorts with this one because this is a standalone. Steve, this is something that we could have brought up at the very beginning because in a lot of Bibles, as soon as you open it, first thing you will see that this is accredited to somebody. In fact, the first 5 books, and a very unusual but wonderful word, Pentateuch. So what is this about?
Well, the Pentateuch is made up of 2 words, penta, meaning 5, and tukos, meaning the case that was used for carrying rolls of papyrus, 5 rolls that go into the case. Historically, those first 5 books were referred to as Torah, which is the law. Moses, that great deliverer of Israel, is the one who, throughout the vast majority of religious tradition, has been seen to be the author of all of those 5 books. There are obviously some other views regarding this that I'm sure that we will touch into. Did Moses actually write Genesis, and did he write the other 4 books of the Bible? As we've engaged with somebody in our comments previously, clearly Moses didn't write all of Deuteronomy because he dies in Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy continues to be written after he's dead. So there is clearly an addition to this. Is that a problem? Not in my opinion. I am not of the school that he physically wrote everything. I think that he narrated it. I think that he was there to recount the detail of it, and he may well have written the vast majority of it. But there were other people around who would have acted as, a bit like with the New Testament, acted as amanuensis, and who would have written his account for him, which was then recorded. So if that means he wrote it, then he wrote it. I suppose it's a bit like having a ghostwriter in modern parlance today, wouldn't it? Where I employ a ghostwriter to write a novel for me, and it goes out under my name, but I didn't write it, but I wrote it.
I think a lot of it starts from, or stems from, Exodus 24:4, which states Moses wrote all of the word of the Lord. There's a lot that happens after that. If people saying, well, that proves that Moses wrote it, then they're already into the weeds, because then what about the rest of it? You are correct. It's the final 8 verses of Deuteronomy. It's 34:5-12, because it talks about his death. So it's plainly obvious that there was an addition by some other. And I think it's that point that is often used by naysayers to say, then obviously this is not all by Moses, as though that addition invalidates everything. And I agree with you. I don't think it does. Although I'm an atheist, there's no problem saying that Moses wrote all this, and I'll like to, along with yourself, explore that and say why that is. None of the 5 books have names attached to them. There's Genesis, and there's Numbers, and there's Exodus, and the Leviticus. Well, okay, you can say that's a name. And Deuteronomy. But they're not named in any way towards Moses, are they?
Because the first 5 books take up that bundle that we call the law, the Torah. And as you just quoted in Exodus, Moses wrote the law. It's almost like a catch-all. It may not make it explicit, but it implies it, certainly with that piece that you read out in Exodus. Look for other aspects of scripture that would look to confirm that sort of thing. I think that the evidence that Moses actually wrote the first 5 books is pretty good. And as I say, by writing, I also mean having an amanuensis. So let me make that clear, yeah? That there was a secretary probably to scribe things down for him as well. So the evidence within the whole of scripture is pretty good and attributes Mosaic authorship to those first 5 books. Jesus in Matthew 19 verse 8, he attributes work to Moses. He does the same in Mark 7 verse 10, Luke 16:29-31, and so on and so forth. And there's numerous other pieces of information that Jesus says Moses is the guy behind this. Now, Jesus may have been wrong. From a Christian perspective, I'm saying, well, yeah, you can think that, but if there's anybody that knows anything about the sacred book that points to him, it is the one who it points to. He understands that there was a real guy called Moses who was the one who should be attributed to authorship of all of these books. Jesus confirms the authorship of the Pentateuch. The rabbinical tradition is solid across the spectrum that Moses was behind those books.
As I said about no name applied to the first 5 books, there wasn't a need to give a specific name. I've got a quotation, and I forgot to put down where I got it from. So I can't cite who said this, or where it is, or even whether it's valid, but here's the quote. Only in the late Second Temple period did rabbis begin to find authors for their scriptures.
I don't know that that is the case, and I'm not saying that because I'm naysaying that quote. What you got to remember is that the written tradition of the Jews, in terms of that great body of work, came about post the Second Temple, so post 70 AD, on the openings of each book, who's attributed to writing stuff.
Exodus starts, now these are the names of the children of Israel, and it starts with the first name is Jacob.
So it may well be that within the Old Testament there are a number of books that the authorship is not 100% known. Little note here says the author of the 1st and 2nd Samuel is anonymous, but Jewish Talmudic tradition says it was written by Samuel. So you may well be onto something that a lot of these books were not ascribed to a particular author, which then makes it even more intriguing. Pre-70 AD, Jesus puts a name to the first 5 books and says these were the books of Moses. Moses wrote this. So that seems to me to nail Moses more firmly onto the mast, in contrast to the Talmudic tradition that may have ascribed names later on. We need to remember that with our Western thinking and our reliance on machines to give us memory to recall what we're doing, I have to look at my calendar every day on my phone to know what time to get up. The ancient people had the ability to memorize so much incredible stuff and to be able to regurgitate it verbatim. We in modern years have lost that. And we are staggered when we can see somebody recite things which are more than a sentence or two. But these people could have recited scroll after scroll after scroll and recited it absolutely perfect. The handing down of oral tradition, while it's odd to us, it doesn't make it any less genuine and it doesn't make it any less accurate at all. We can be skeptical about it because why wouldn't we be? Because everything we are in life these days is skeptical. If you can't prove it, I'm never going to believe it. Crap. Which is a problem for just your whole way of living, to be quite honest. I just want to clarify a point that I made, because I'd hate for somebody to pick up and go, no, he didn't say that. When I said that Jesus says that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, I am saying that Jesus certainly held that belief that Moses wrote the Pentateuch because he alludes to Moses writing the Pentateuch. He does not say in the exact phrase, and Moses wrote the Pentateuch. The 3 verses are quoted from Matthew, Mark and Luke. Jesus is speaking and he says, Moses said, or Moses permitted. So I just want to clarify that.
Anybody who studied art history may have come across the artworks of the great fresco painters, medieval period, like Fra Angelico. Everything that you see would be his, except they weren't, because no person can do the amount of work needed to do those frescoes. So he would have had a team. Well, same with writing. You've already said the word amanuensis, or amanuenses, because there could have been more than one. Why are they important?
An amanuensis is somebody who is skilled in shorthand, skilled in the ability to record information, and who would be travelling alongside an orator or somebody who could deliver a message, and they would note what they had to say. Or they would act like a dictaphone, a secretary, a PA, somebody who was really well versed in being able to handle words, and they would be able to record what the individual that they had in front of them was saying. Think of a court stenographer when they're sat there tapping away on all of the account, what's being said and how it's being said. As we've touched on already, I think it's really important to understand that there were certain things that were spoken and were recorded by this stenographer of the court, the person who was skilled in letters and who was able to capture the story. John Mark very likely wrote the Gospel of Mark based on sitting down with Peter and getting Peter to tell him his account of what it was like being with Jesus. I've just finished teaching through the book of Colossians. And right at the very end of Colossians, Paul almost like takes the pen off somebody and says, now I sort of close this out and here I am, it's me, Paul, in my own handwriting. And that was probably a young pastor called Timothy, who is the recipient of two of the what are called the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy. Timothy, who was acting as an amanuensis. You're right, there is more than one person involved in pulling stuff together. But again, that doesn't detract from the centrality of who is the artist behind it, or in this case, the author behind it.
There's a very old book by David McDill. It's called The Mosaic Authorship of the Pentateuch. He talks about the amanuenses, and he says, and I'll quote, "These may have sometimes employed their own style of thought and language." A lot of source criticism of the 19th century looked at the Bible and said, well, these are written in a different style. The words seem to be different, and that's possibly why. It would be similar to you, Steve, writing a book and you've got somebody to help you, and one is a Maori and one's French and one is Spanish. They're going to use slight differences in the language to put down your words. You'll know this as well, of course, being a detective. If we saw a road accident and you and I were opposite sides of the road and we got somebody in the accident involved and some bystanders up the road, and we all had to go and write something down, we would report what happened, but they won't necessarily all be similar. There's going to be slight changes in the way that the words are used and the order in which things happened. If there are differences in the text, well, so what? Because ultimately, what really matters is the integrity of the message, and that could be the same for any book written at any time in history.
Your use of the analogy of a car accident is absolutely spot on, which to me gives even more integrity to the book. You go and take statements off 5 people, all who have been witness to a serious assault or something like that. If every single witness agrees in every material particular, there's something wrong. Somebody's doing something not right. The order of things will sometimes be different depending on who's actually recounting that story. That doesn't make any of it less true. What it makes it is quite real. If you have everybody agree in every material particular, I would be thinking these guys have got their heads together and they've hatched a plot here to try and cause a problem for somebody, because everything agrees to the tiniest degree. And that is not life. That is not real. Now, there would be people who would say, no, it must be real. That's the most scientific way to do it. There is no deviance. There's deviance in life. You need to be honest about that. This is one of the things that I really like about the Bible. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is, which is flawed human beings trying in their best possible way through inspiration of the Holy Spirit to actually capture as much detail as they can. Think about this. Moses, he's an ideal person to be placed in this position. Why is that? Because he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. He would have been steeped in all sorts of ancient wisdom as he was being raised as a young prince in the land of Egypt. He would have had some of the best tutors. He would have had some of the best input into his life to give him the best possible opportunity to be the one that could be a recipient for divine inspiration. He wasn't just some backwater dude. He wasn't a public speaker, which is why his brother Aaron had to go and do the speaking for him, because he wasn't a speaker for whatever reason. He then has this meeting with Yahweh, who discloses his covenant name to him, and who then must, at some point during their relationship, show him how he made the world. And Moses has got to try and grab all of that and portray that in a way that makes sense to the ancient people that he then has to deliver that message to. It's like sending a jet fighter back into the Middle Ages and for the people there to describe that phenomena. How the hell would they do it? A big bird? A big bird spitting fire from the back and spitting fire from the front when it launched a missile?
Yeah.
There's so much when you look at whatever he saw and how he saw it. He had to convey and distill the intent of God and the order that God did things in a way that made sense to the people that were going to receive it. That's staggering that he's been able to do that. And I think that Jordan Peterson has done an amazing job when he's looked at Genesis and looked at it just from a psychological perspective and how it so stacks up with clinical practice in terms of this is the way we know people work. These are thousands of years old, these books. And it does annoy me when people just are so dismissive of it. It's all a crock of crap. It's all of this, it's all that. And I think you can't be bothered to engage your thinking. Yes, critique it, pull it apart. That's exactly what I did 14, 15 years ago. Yeah, I would encourage you, go and do it.
Some people just argue the toss. They'll just argue everything. Critic doesn't mean somebody who's always poking holes. It's just saying, think about where these things come from. Literal criticism. What a lot of the debate is just trying to measure fog with calipers. A book called The Mosaic Authorship Controversy by Edward Andrews talks of all the history of people who were poo-pooing this. So you go back to Ibn Ezra of the 12th century, Thomas Hobbes, and Benedict Spinoza of the 17th, David Hume of the 18th, Julius Wellhausen, the German academic I mentioned before, the 19th. They say Moses did not write all of it. Turns out they were correct, because obviously he didn't. So what? You could talk about the J source and the E source and the P source and the D, which is Yahwist, Elohim, Priestly, Deuteronomist. Something that I said at the very beginning when we did Genesis, I used to be interested in. But I'm thinking, hang on, why? Because there's multiple input into a typical encyclopedia. Does that invalidate that? No, it doesn't. Andrews says this. Liberal Christianity says that Moses did not pen every word from Genesis through Deuteronomy. They conclude that this is nothing more than a tradition that originated in the times that the Jews returned from their exile in Babylon in 537 BCE, or Old BC, and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. The source critics reason that there was and is a misunderstanding of Deuteronomy 31:9, which says that Moses wrote this law and delivered it unto the priests, the sons of Levi, that bear the ark of the covenant of Jehovah, and unto all the elders of Israel. They argue that Deuteronomy only implies that Moses wrote the laws of Deuteronomy chapters 12 to 28. Moreover, this was extended into a tradition that encompassed the belief that the entire Pentateuch was not written by Moses. End quote. As I said before, does it matter? There's a lady called Aminata Fana who says, don't judge a book by its author. It's what it says. There's too many people who are more interested in the packaging than what's in the box. And I think that's half the problem.
I still come back to the point that I think that Moses is the author in so much as he was the orator. He was the one who recounted all of these events that he saw. But I do think that there may have been one, two more amanuensis, people that actually wrote this down. And it may well be that on such and such a day he had John helping him, and then Bill on the next day, and Fred on the day after that. And those three documents were put together, written by three different people, but they're all the words of Moses. And so you're going to get variants of style, you'll get variants of word usage, you'll get all sorts of different variants. If somebody says that Moses didn't write it, i.e. that this is not something that Moses actually said, and it's all coming from somebody else, then I'd say, well, I'm not sure about that at all. I've got no problems with it all being compiled together and put into a cohesive, ordered structure, and that may well have been post-Moses' death. They could have divvied that up and sorted it out and said, well, what bits have you got? Well, I've got he said this and I've got he said this. And how does that go in the narrative? Right, let's put it all together. And now we've got one big scroll that says all of this. I've got no issue with that at all. In fact, you make a mosaic out of Moses, don't you?
Very good.
So I wouldn't have a problem with that. I would have a problem saying, well, actually, Moses didn't say any of it. And some other person wrote it in 300 years later. And I go, well, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. For me, that undermines the intent of the book. Also, remember that the Hebrew was translated into the Greek at least 300 odd years before Christ walked the earth, in the Greek Septuagint format. This book's been around for a long time.
I just want to re-emphasize what you talked about ghostwriters. A ghostwriter is someone who will be writing but won't get the credit for it. There are many celebrity books that come out with the name of the celebrity on it, but they've not written any of it. And in fact, even some people that are considered to be authors haven't written the work. It may come as a shock to some people that Eric van Lustbader ghosted for Robert Ludlum. Robert passed away, and to finish off a book, Eric van Lustbader finished off for him. The Count of Monte Cristo was partly ghost written. So some of the classic books that we consider as some of the greatest books ever written weren't actually written wholly by the person whose name is on the front cover. Does that invalidate those books? I don't think it does. No one seems to have a problem with them, so no one should have a problem with Moses having written the first 5 books. I'm just going to finish off with a quotation. The Anam Chara, or The Spiritual Wisdom from the Celtic World, is written by John O'Donoghue. He talks about the following. This is what, for me, the Pentateuch is all about. Words are the oblique mirrors that hold your thoughts. You gaze into these word mirrors. and catch glimpses of meaning, belonging, and shelter. Behind their bright surfaces is the dark and the silence. Words are like the god Janus, or Janus in Latin. They face outward and inward at once. How do I link that to the first 5 books? The books are full of words and phrases. They're like mirrors for our thoughts. In this case, you, as a Christian, would say it's God, via Moses, coming to you, the outward reach of those words. As an atheist, I would accept the same. The key is how you interpret them. It's the inward penetration of those words into your mind. They're like mirrors to the world and to our soul, but it's a two-way mirror. And I think rather than talking about the mechanics of who wrote what, who did this, it's the message. Go beyond the words and look what's behind them. Why do people revere them in more than one faith? Why do people revere them who are not of those faiths?
There is an author behind the author, and that's what you've touched into. We're talking about a divine author who is working through human agency in order to convey a message. And the message is to show how his basic principles and interactions with humanity are such that a relationship can be developed with him in order to empower and for the betterment of humanity. That is the thrust of where all of this comes from.
Okay, mate, so thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Pleasure. You take care, fella. Bye-bye.